The morning sun barely penetrated the thick steel and glass of the Zenith Corporate Tower in downtown Chicago, casting long shadows over the polished marble floors of its grand lobby. Beneath the gleaming facade of ambition and wealth, a quiet tension simmered, one that whispered louder than the elevator chimes and echoed in the heels clicking crisply across stone. As the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, inside the air seemed to pause the moment Cassandra Brooks entered. She stepped through the revolving doors with a deliberate grace that was almost imperceptible. Alone, her figure silhouetted against the cold gleam of the lobby's modernist art, she seemed at once part of the scene and wholly alien to it. She carried no entourage, no ostentatious signs of power, just a slim leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm and a purposeful look in her eyes. The receptionist barely glanced up before returning to her keyboard, but others noticed. They always noticed. Cassandra was a black woman, sharply dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet power, but bore none of the flashiness that the Zenith boardroom elites favored. Her natural curls were pulled back into a sleek knot, her skin radiant against the sterile white walls. And yet to those watching from behind glass partitions and along the periphery of the lobby, she was a question mark, an anomaly, a woman who didn't fit into the neat categories they'd constructed for success in this world. They didn't know her name. They didn't care to. But she wasn't there to be seen. She was there to be heard. As she approached the elevator bank, a pair of executives in tailored navy suits exited, hastily murmuring about closing deals and dinner reservations. One of them, a tall man with graying temples, glanced at her with a flicker of recognition. Or was it suspicion? Cassandra met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable. He looked away first. Inside the elevator, the polished brass reflected her image back, at her poised, professional, composed. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, glanced at the floor indicator, and drew a slow, steady breath. This wasn't her first boardroom. It wasn't her first time walking into a space where her presence alone challenged assumptions. But it was the first time she was carrying data, real, undeniable proof that could change everything. Up on the 58th floor, the Zenith corporate boardroom awaited, a room where billion-dollar decisions were made with the flick of a pen, where polished smiles concealed sharpened knives, and where the unspoken rules of power were enforced not with fists, but with exclusion. Cassandra had seen it before, the way meetings were steered by those whose voices filled the room before they even spoke, the way proposals were weighed not on merit, but on who delivered them. But today, she wasn't here to plead for approval. She was here to deliver a proposal that had already passed through federal review, a plan for a sustainable infrastructure overhaul that could reshape entire communities. It was ambitious, data-backed, and meticulously constructed, and yet she knew the risk. She knew that when she stepped into that room, her skin, her gender, her status as a single mother, all would walk in before her credentials. The elevator slowed, its mechanical hum a prelude to the silence waiting beyond the doors. Cassandra straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and as the doors opened, she stepped onto the executive floor with a confidence that masked the quiet fury coiling beneath her calm exterior. The hallway was hushed, carpeted, lined with abstract paintings and glass walls, behind which senior executives conferred in low voices. A few glanced up as she passed, their expressions momentarily curious, then dismissive. They saw the slim portfolio, the understated heels, the woman walking alone without a badge of corporate insignia, and they drew their conclusions. She approached the main reception for the executive suite were a woman with a tight bun and a nameplate that read Lauren Green. Strategy lead was engaged in a hushed conversation with an assistant. Lauren's voice dropped when she saw Cassandra. "Can I help you?" She asked, her tone polite, but laced with the faintest edge of condescension. Cassandra held her gaze. "I'm here for the 9:00 a.m. meeting with the Zenith Board regarding EcoStream." Lauren's brows twitched ever so slightly. EcoStream. That's... She caught herself, glanced at the screen in front of her, and plastered on a professional smile. "Of course. Please wait here." Cassandra nodded, her face impassive. But she noticed everything: the whispered exchange, the sidelong glance, the subtle tightening of posture. This wasn't new. It was the same choreography she had faced in every room where her worth had been questioned, before her words were even heard. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the quiet strength in her, the weight of data and strategy and lived experience she carried with her. They didn't know that today she wasn't here to ask for permission. She was here to test the boundaries of their assumptions. And as she sat down in the waiting area, legs crossed, portfolio on her lap, she let the silence settle around her like armor. Outside, the city stretched its steel and glass toward the sky, oblivious to the storm that was gathering quietly inside these walls. They didn't know it yet. But by the time the sun set over Chicago that evening, everything in this building, every assumption, every rule, every hierarchy would shift. And it would all start with her. The clock on the executive floor ticked softly, marking time and measured heartbeats as Cassandra Brooks sat poised in the waiting lounge outside the Zenith boardroom. Every minute that passed without acknowledgement wasn't just a delay. It was a deliberate statement. They knew she was here. Her appointment was confirmed. Yet as the seconds dragged into minutes, the air grew heavier with the weight of calculated neglect. Finally, a slender woman in an impeccable navy dress emerged from behind the frosted glass door. "Ms. Brooks," she said crisply, as though just now discovering her presence. "We're ready for you." Cassandra rose without haste, gathering her portfolio. Her smile, subtle and reserved, did not betray the flicker of fire rising in her chest. She followed the woman down a corridor of framed accolades and industry awards that lined the walls like silent sentinels of power. The corridor opened into the Zenith boardroom, a cathedral of corporate ambition with a long, polished table at its center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's steel and glass skyline. But it was the human landscape that Cassandra noted first. Around the table sat a dozen executives, men and women, but mostly men, dressed in suits that whispered wealth and authority. Their faces were practiced masks of professionalism, but behind their eyes lingered the subtle gleam of condescension. At the head of the table sat Alan Whitmore, Zenith's CEO, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like the shadow of a skyscraper at dusk. He rose briefly, his smile thin and perfunctory. "Ms. Brooks, welcome. Please have a seat." Cassandra took the seat reserved for her near the middle of the table. The subtlety of the placement was not lost on her, neither at the head nor at the farthest end, but just close enough to be acknowledged while still peripheral. She laid her portfolio on the table and met the eyes of the board members with calm clarity. "We understand you've prepared a proposal," Whitmore said smoothly, his voice a practiced baritone that filled the room with authority. "We're eager to hear your ideas." Cassandra's voice was steady, her words deliberate as she outlined the key elements of her EcoStream initiative. She spoke of scalable, renewable energy solutions, of federal partnerships, of data-backed projections for long-term growth and sustainability. The figures were precise, the model airtight, designed to impress, not with flash, but with substance. But as she spoke, she noticed the shifts, the subtle exchanges of glances, the half-smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the low hum of whispered commentary that was just quiet enough to remain plausible deniability. A tall man with a silver tie, Gregory Tate Zenith's chief financial officer, leaned back in his chair. Fingers steepled a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Impressive numbers," he said when she paused. "But I have to ask, have you led an initiative of this scale before? I mean, it's quite ambitious for someone stepping into these circles." Cassandra met his gaze without a flicker of emotion. "I led a federal pilot in Baltimore last year that delivered a $4.2 million return on a $600,000 seed investment. The metrics are in your packets." Tate's smirk deepened, but he said nothing more. Across the table, another board member, a woman named Eleanor Green, tilted her head, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "Of course, numbers are one thing, but execution is another. Scaling beyond pilot projects can be complicated, wouldn't you agree?" Cassandra inclined her head slightly. "That's why we've pre-secured regional partnerships and compliance approvals. We're not starting from scratch. This is a strategic expansion, not a gamble." Her words hung in the air, clean and sharp, but the undertone of the room shifted. The polite smiles tightened. The questions grew more pointed, more dismissive. They weren't challenging her model. They were challenging her presence, her right to be in this room, her audacity to speak with authority. It wasn't about data. It was about her. Whitmore leaned forward, folding his hands as if confiding something. "Ms. Brooks, I'm sure you understand. We have to be cautious. The market is volatile, and decisions at this level carry weight. Your proposal is thorough, but it's aggressive. We need to be certain you can navigate these waters without overreach." Cassandra's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "The federal alignment mitigates market volatility. It's not overreach, it's foresight." A ripple of murmurs passed around the table. A younger executive, Tom Kingston, whose department had likely been tasked with background research, chuckled softly. "Foresight is great, but sometimes caution wins the day." That was the moment the mask cracked. The room's tone shifted from polite skepticism to thinly veiled mockery. Gregory Tate laughed under his breath. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Whitmore. Tom murmured something to his neighbor, just audible enough for Cassandra to catch overconfidence can be endearing. They didn't say it outright. They didn't need to. Every slight, every undermining comment, every patronizing smile, they were the knives hidden beneath silk tablecloths. They weren't debating the merits of her proposal. They were dismissing her. Not because her numbers were weak, but because her presence, her identity, her sheer audacity to sit at this table was seen as an affront to the unspoken order of things. Cassandra felt the heat rise beneath her skin, the pulse quickening at her throat, but she did not falter. She closed her portfolio with a soft, deliberate click and looked directly at Whitmore. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I trust you've seen enough to make your decision." Whitmore's smile faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. We'll be in touch." Cassandra stood, gathering her materials. As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of every dismissive glance, every quiet chuckle, every smug smirk. But she also felt something else, a rising, unbreakable clarity. They thought they had played her. They thought they had orchestrated her exit, a quiet, clean dismissal. But they didn't know the game she was playing. And as she stepped back into the corridor, her reflection glinting in the polished glass, she realized they had just handed her the one thing they feared most, an opportunity to show them exactly how mistaken they were. The city lights had begun to blur into a shifting mosaic as Cassandra Brooks sat in the back seat of the town car that sped through the rain-slicked streets. The Zenith executive's dismissive laughter still echoed faintly in her mind, but it was like distant thunder compared to the storm gathering within her. The humiliation in that boardroom was not unfamiliar. It was the sharpened, familiar blade of a system that mistook her silence for acquiescence. But this time, it had underestimated the resilience coiled beneath her poised exterior. The car pulled to a stop at a nondescript office tower, its only sign a discreet brass plate reading Federal Oversight Liaison Office, Chicago Division. Cassandra stepped out her heels, clicking softly against the concrete as she entered the lobby. The security guard glanced up his face, registering instant recognition as he offered her a respectful nod. She returned it with a brief smile, then proceeded to the express elevator at the back. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, enclosing her in silence. At the top floor, the space opened into a modern minimalist suite. Glass walls revealed a war room of sorts maps and data streams lining the walls, compliance reports scrolling in real time on screens. Cassandra stepped into a side office where a slender woman with close-cropped hair looked up from her desk. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "Director Langston is ready for you." Cassandra nodded, her face composed, and stepped into the conference room. Inside, the director of the Department of Energy's Federal Infrastructure Alignment Task Force sat at the head of the table. Langston was a man whose quiet demeanor belied the immense influence he wielded. He rose as Cassandra entered, extending his hand. "Welcome back, Cassandra," he said, his voice warm but edged with the formality of high stakes. "We've been watching closely." She accepted his handshake, her posture both graceful and unyielding. "Thank you, Director," she replied. "I assume you've seen the preliminary reports from the Zenith meeting." Langston gestured to the stack of files in front of him. "I have. And I must say, it's even more revealing than we anticipated. Their dismissal of your proposal wasn't merely a business decision, it's a case study in systemic exclusion." Cassandra's eyes flickered, but her voice remained calm. They underestimated the stakes. They thought they were dismissing a single mother with an ambitious idea. They didn't know they were turning away the federal liaison for the next phase of the Green Horizon Initiative. Langston's mouth tightened into a thin line. "The way they handled you is an embarrassment, but it's also a gift. You've exposed the rot beneath their polished surface. And now, we're prepared to act." For months, Cassandra had operated quietly behind the scenes, meticulously building her portfolio, securing partnerships, and preparing the federal alignment documentation. What Zenith's board had failed to grasp was that her presence at the table wasn't a pitch, it was an evaluation. The $300 million infrastructure partnership they believed they controlled was in truth contingent upon her assessment of their eligibility and integrity, and they had failed. Langston slid a heavy folder across the table. Inside were detailed compliance reports, transcripts, and recorded exchanges from the meeting. Cassandra flipped through them, her expression unreadable. I assume the evidence will suffice to justify their removal from the program. Langston nodded. It does. Effective immediately, Zenith is disqualified from federal consideration. Their behavior violated multiple clauses in the compliance agreement, particularly concerning equitable access and anti-discrimination protocols. Cassandra exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing the folder's edge. They played themselves, she murmured, almost to herself. Then she straightened, her voice steady. I'll prepare the formal statement for release. But first, I have one more meeting. Langston's brow lifted. You're returning to Zenith. She met his gaze with quiet steel. Not as Cassandra Brooks, the hopeful entrepreneur. As Cassandra Brooks, the federal compliance lead for Green Horizon. Langston's smile was fleeting, but approving. Then let them see the full measure of the power they dismissed. Hours later, Cassandra re-entered Zenith's glass tower, her presence as quiet and commanding as the first time, but this time, the atmosphere shifted the moment she stepped through the doors. The receptionist, previously disinterested, now stiffened at her approach. Ms. Brooks, she stammered. Mr. Whitmore's team. They'll see me now, Cassandra said calmly, flashing the authorization badge she hadn't revealed before, its emblem gleaming with the seal of the Department of Energy. The badge's simple red stripe marked her as the key compliance officer for federal contracts, a symbol of authority that no boardroom smirk could erase. The elevator carried her smoothly upward, and when the doors opened, a hush fell across the floor. Executives turned, expressions shifting from polite surprise to dawning panic. Cassandra stepped out, her portfolio tucked under one arm, and made her way to the boardroom with a purposeful grace. Whitmore stood at the head of the table, his face blanching as she approached. Miss Brooks, he began, his tone straining for control. We weren't expecting. You should have been. She interrupted, her voice low but unwavering. As of this morning, I am authorized to deliver final decisions on federal eligibility for the Green Horizon Initiative. Your firm's conduct has been reviewed. The outcome is disqualification, effective immediately. The silence was absolute. The polished table reflected the stunned faces of the executives, their composure crumbling like a fragile veneer. Cassandra held their gaze, her voice clear. You dismissed me, not because of my data, but because you couldn't see past your own assumptions. And now, you'll face the consequences, not of your disbelief, but of your arrogance. She laid the formal documentation on the table, her movements deliberate. This is no longer a discussion. It's a verdict. As she turned and walked from the room, leaving behind the stunned silence of shattered egos and collapsed ambitions, Cassandra felt a profound stillness settle over her. The storm had not passed. It had merely revealed its true center. And she stood there unshaken in the eye of its quiet, devastating power. The elevator's gentle descent felt almost too slow for the weight Cassandra Brooks carried. Yet as each floor slipped by, the tension didn't fade, it crystallized. When the polished doors opened onto the lobby of Zenith Tower, the air hung heavy with unspoken tension. The receptionist at the front desk, who had once offered only condescending glances, now straightened, as if uncertain how to greet her. Cassandra returned the gaze with an inscrutable calm before moving steadily toward the exit. Outside, the city's pulse continued, unabated cars streaming past, people moving with purpose, oblivious to the quiet implosion occurring within the building behind her. But Cassandra felt it like a distant thunderclap, one that would reverberate long after she had left. She stood at the curb for a moment, breathing in the crisp afternoon air. The coolness bit at her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the boardroom she'd just left. Her mind was quiet now, the adrenaline giving way to a deeper, more profound clarity. What she had done wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving her worth to men like Whitmore or his polished inner circle. It was about justice, not the loud banner-waving kind, but the quiet, irrevocable sort that redefines the rules of the game. She knew, with the certainty of lived experience, that true power rarely needed to shout. It could whisper, could move beneath the surface until the day it rose, unmistakable and undeniable. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Cassandra stepped inside. She gave the driver a small nod before sinking into the leather seat. As the car merged into traffic, she stared out the window at the shifting skyline, her thoughts trailing to the events of the morning. She had walked into Zenith's lair not as an applicant, but as a sentinel, carrying with her the power of an entire federal mandate. They had seen a woman asking for permission. They had failed to recognize the woman who held the pen that could rewrite their future. And now, the ramifications were already rippling through the upper echelons of Zenith's corridors. She imagined the hurried calls being made, the desperate attempts to salvage reputations to shift blame. Emails sent in panicked bursts, voices raised behind closed doors, careers teetering on the brink. But Cassandra's role was not to be the instrument of their destruction. It was to be the mirror that reflected their own complicity. At a red light, her phone buzzed softly. A message from Director Langston appeared on the screen. Formal disqualification letter delivered. Federal compliance review initiated. Well done. She read it once, then let the message fade into the quiet hum of the city. There was no satisfaction in the words, only a sense of inevitability. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a necessary reckoning. Cassandra's mind drifted back to her daughter Lena. She thought of the mornings they'd spent together, of the quiet conversations over breakfast, where she had taught her about dignity, resilience, and the quiet strength of knowing one's worth. Lena, too, would one day face rooms filled with subtle slights and disguised scorn. But she would walk in with her head high, carrying not just her own legacy, but the lessons Cassandra had fought so hard to embody. Today's reckoning wasn't just for Cassandra. It was for every woman, every person who had ever been reduced to silence in the face of systemic arrogance. The car pulled up to the curb outside her modest townhouse in Bronzeville, the neighborhood where history whispered from brick facades and family-run shops. Cassandra stepped out her heels, tapping softly on the sidewalk. She paused at her front steps, the weight of the day pressing gently against her shoulders. She knew that inside, Lena would be waiting with 100 questions, her curious eyes wide, her voice eager. Cassandra would answer them all not with bitterness, but with the quiet, unwavering assurance of a woman who had faced down giants and stood unshaken. Inside the house, the familiar scent of home greeted her. She set her portfolio down on the entry table, loosened her jacket, and exhaled deeply. Lena appeared from the living room, a book clutched in her hands. "Mom, how did your meeting go?" She asked, her voice laced with both concern and excitement. Cassandra crouched down, gathering her daughter into a gentle embrace. "It went well," she said softly. "Some people learned an important lesson today." Lena tilted her head. "Did they finally understand what you were trying to tell them?" Cassandra's lips curved into a faint smile. "I think they did, baby. Sometimes people don't listen until they see the truth for themselves." She stood brushing a stray lock of hair from Lena's face, and when they see it, it's impossible to ignore. The quiet of their home settled around them like a protective cocoon, but Cassandra's mind remained on the city beyond. She knew that tomorrow would bring headlines that the story would twist and turn through public channels, dissected and debated. There would be those who applauded her actions, those who resented them, and those who tried to rewrite the narrative to suit their own ends. But none of it would change what had been set in motion. Truth had been unveiled not with fury, but with the unshakable weight of evidence and principle. That evening, as she tucked Lena into bed and listened to her daughter's steady breathing, Cassandra stood by the window, watching the moon rise over the city skyline. The soft glow bathed the streets below, illuminating a world that was in so many ways slow to change. But it would change. And it would do so because people like her refused to be invisible, refused to let silence be mistaken for surrender. In that moment, Cassandra felt an unspoken connection to the countless others who had faced similar battles, some who had triumphed, others who had been buried by the weight of indifference. She thought of them, honored them, and drew strength from the shared struggle. Her story was not just hers alone. It was part of a larger tapestry, woven through generations of quiet resistance and steady resolve. As the night deepened, she whispered into the quiet room, not as a declaration, but as a promise. The silence is over. In the quiet hours before dawn, Cassandra Brooks stood by the window of her modest home watching as the first pale light crept over the Bronzeville rooftops. The city's hum was distant, the streets still shadowed by night's lingering embrace. But in that stillness, she felt something shift, not in the world outside, but within her own heart. This wasn't the end of a battle, nor the culmination of her struggle. It was the opening of a door she had once thought would remain forever sealed. Her phone vibrated on the side table. A simple message illuminated the screen. Official statement released. Federal compliance has voided Zenith's eligibility for the 300-monitor contract. It was a confirmation, not a surprise. The machinery of justice, slow and often burdened by inertia, had finally turned in her favor. She knew the consequences of that action would ripple far beyond Zenith's sterile boardrooms. It would touch lives like hers, and Lena's, and countless others who had been marginalized and silenced. She inhaled deeply, her breath slow and deliberate. It wasn't triumph she felt, but a complex mixture of vindication and mourning. A part of her mourned the necessity of what had happened, the careers undone, the reputations tarnished, the families affected. But another part, the part that had endured, whispered condescension and systemic exclusion, understood the deeper truth. This wasn't about retribution. It was about responsibility, about ensuring that power could no longer hide behind polished conference tables and carefully curated facades. Downstairs, Lena stirred her small voice, calling softly from her room. Cassandra moved without hesitation, descending the stairs and entering her daughter's room, where sunlight now streaked through the blinds, casting long lines across the floor. Lena blinked up at her sleep, still clinging to her lashes. "Did they listen, Mama?" she asked, her voice tentative. Cassandra sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a hand gently across Lena's curls. "They did," she said quietly, "but not because I spoke louder, because I made them see what they tried to ignore." Lena's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and understanding, her young mind grappling with the enormity of her mother's battle. "Does that mean you won?" she asked. Cassandra smiled faintly. It's not about winning or losing baby. It's about standing up, even when it's hard, even when you're scared. And it's about making sure the truth gets seen. They sat there in a silence that felt sacred as the weight of Cassandra's words settled between them. She thought of the emails and calls that would undoubtedly flood her inbox today, of the apologies from those who once dismissed her, and the strategic overtures from firms eager to align with her integrity now that the tides had shifted. She thought of the quiet allies like Thomas Wren, who had recognized her worth before it became undeniable. And she thought of those still trapped in systems that rewarded silence over courage. Rising from the bed, she glanced once more at the morning light spilling across the room. She didn't know what the next steps would look like, but she was certain of one thing: she would no longer ask permission to be heard. Whether in boardrooms or classrooms, whether standing alone or leading a chorus of voices, she would carry this moment forward, not as a badge of victory, but as a torch of resolve. Later that day, as the news of Zenith's downfall spread across industry wires and social media, Cassandra sat with Lena on their front stoop, sharing ice cream cones beneath a sky that had finally cleared of storm clouds. Passers-by glanced their way, some with recognition, others with curiosity, but Cassandra's gaze remained steady. Her focus not on the whispers, but on the simple joy of that moment. "Are you going to keep fighting?" Lena asked, her voice small but certain. Cassandra looked down at her daughter, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "Yes," she said softly, "but this time I won't be fighting alone." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and amber, Cassandra felt the weight of her journey lift slightly from her shoulders. It wasn't over. It might never be. But for the first time, she felt the possibility of a world where standing firm wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a step toward something better, something lasting. And as dusk settled over Bronzeville, she knew with quiet certainty that while the road ahead was long, it was no longer one she would walk in shadows. It was a new dawn, not for redemption or ruin, but for resilience, for truth, and for the quiet, unbreakable power of being seen. Cassandra Brooks' journey is one of quiet but relentless defiance against systemic exclusion, revealing the power of unwavering dignity and truth in the face of corporate indifference. From the moment she stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Zenith Capital, she knew she would not be seen for her accomplishments or expertise. Her presence, a black single mother holding a meticulously prepared proposal, was met with thinly veiled disdain and deliberate obstacles. Yet Cassandra didn't retreat. She endured the whispers, the condescending glances, the orchestrated delays, and the outright sabotage of her fiscal data, knowing that her resilience was not for their approval, but for the truth she carried. When the layers of corporate power and prejudice finally crumbled, it wasn't because Cassandra demanded recognition with loud declarations. It was because she built her case with precision and integrity, waited for the right moment, and let her work speak louder than any accusation could. Her eventual revelation as a federal liaison, the very person holding the keys to Zenith's coveted $300 million contract, sent shockwaves through the industry. But it was her composed grace, her refusal to retaliate, and her commitment to justice that marked the real victory. She exposed a system designed to exclude, not to punish, but to correct. And in doing so, she forced an institution to confront its own biases and failures. Cassandra's story is not just a tale of professional triumph. It's a testament to the power of perseverance and the necessity of creating spaces where truth and merit can finally eclipse prejudice. It reminds us that strength is not always in the loudest voice, but in the quiet resolve to stand tall and unyielding even when the world dismisses you. Her path was carved not by anger, but by clarity and purpose, and through it, she has illuminated a way forward for countless others. The lesson from Cassandra's journey is clear. We must cultivate the courage to confront injustice not with hostility, but with an unshakable commitment to integrity. In our daily lives, this means speaking up when we see unfairness, supporting those who are marginalized, and creating environments where everyone is valued for their contributions, not excluded for their identities. It's about recognizing that change doesn't come from a single moment of defiance, but from the consistent, deliberate actions we take to dismantle systems of bias and exclusion. For every viewer watching this, let Cassandra's story inspire you to stand firm in your convictions, to lead with empathy, and to never underestimate the impact of your quiet strength. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that spotlight resilience, challenge injustice, and celebrate the indomitable human spirit. Your support fuels our mission to keep these important conversations alive and to create content that not only informs, but transforms. Don't miss out on our next powerful story. Subscribe now and join us in making a difference.